The podcast tour problem. If you have something like a book or something to say, then there are mostly two options, one could say. One could either use existing media entities, or one creates a media entity on one's own. Now, the first thing, obviously, to a certain extent seems easier, because you don't have to think about the brand design, the channel, and also what this show will hold in the future once you might not have an interest that is promoting your book. So there has to be kind of a bigger arch to this, and maybe a little bit of strategic thinking. One could also make it the case, or not the case, but the point that distribution, to a certain extent at least now these days, is free. So you could record with the phone you already have and the microphone you already have. Of course, there would be maybe additional value in getting an additionally good or a little bit of a better microphone, and maybe recording with a camera. And then maybe you get two cameras, and then maybe you do something else, and maybe you have 25 other points, and then it becomes very complicated real quick. So it seems to be the case that many people seem to choose the option to go to an established show. In the past, this could be a TV show, for example. This could also be, well, a TV show, mostly. Now, these days, it's not so much a TV show any longer, but just a show. The format of the show still kind of lives on. One could also make the point, not the point in this, one could also make the case for the idea that podcasts, to a certain extent, are actually just talk shows. Now, kind of a subset of shows or TV shows. Now, the TV show is kind of just a distribution format. Now, of course, specific shows also maybe run better on TV, but then once the internet came along, many people had more access to this, because the cost of technology and also now the cost of access basically got reduced. So therefore, more people now would have the opportunity, or had the opportunity, and still are having increasingly the opportunity to publish themselves. But with this comes the cost of strategic thinking and planning and figuring this out, and also carrying the responsibility of the format of your choosing. Now, if you go to a show, let's say you have a ridiculous new cure and you write a book about it, and then you go onto a show to promote this book as well as the cure, and you want to sell this cure. Now, if the show then wants to sell the podcast interview in this case, because I still am talking now about podcasts, even though you could also describe these days podcasts, at least the ones that are approximating kind of what a TV show or a talk show was in the past. If you then go onto a show to promote your cure, then there is an incentive on the side of the show or the host, which sometimes are the same person, but sometimes there is also a bigger team behind the show. Now, if this So there's kind of an unspoken or maybe also spoken out agreement that the show provides the novelty, and the show host or the show makers provide basically the stability of the media format. Now, because the novelty is provided by the guest, and because the showmaker has an interest to kind of sell their show also, so the first point isn't necessarily a cause now for this, but the second point is a cause for this. So the showmakers have an incentive to now promote this. Similarly to how if you wrote a book, for example, or if you interviewed somebody, then you now basically can leverage the not necessarily the interest, but you now can say, okay, this person is really interesting. And because you're not talking about yourself, this is also not showing off, but it is instead it is also indirectly showing off if you have like a very relevant guest on your show, and like, this person is so cool and he happens to be on my show, which also rubs off in terms of association onto me, because I am getting along with these people and I now play in the league of these people. Now, apart from this, the showmaker now, and this is what I want to deduct from this, the showmaker now has an interest. And this interest is to, instead of titling, okay, there is a research paper that showed maybe there is some merit to this new thing, which might increase your life expectancy by 0.3%. Instead, what often seems to be happening, at least if you take a look at any thumbnail on YouTube and any title on YouTube or traditional media headlines, kind of, that the showmaker or the media entity that is kind of the stability providing entity is then taking what has been said and is kind of exaggerating, because the more they exaggerate, the more it seems to then spark interest in the reader. So of course this is similarly to how maybe our diet also might have become increasingly hostile to a human body, one could say, or the diet environment or the food environment, by one person adding maybe a little bit of sugar to the bread and then maybe selling more bread, and then the next person might add a little bit of fat to the bread and also the sugar, and then the next person has a new idea, maybe just a little bit more sugar and a little bit more bread, and the same kind of leveraging and basically going up to maybe local optimum, or not necessarily optimum, but a point where basically at least a local equilibrium, one could say. And in terms of social media, it seems to be the case that this thing, so first of all, this thing is kind of also still in its infancy, and therefore clickbaiting seems to be still something that is existing. I also caught myself often in clickbaiting my own videos in the beginning when I still titled these videos, but now I have kind of chosen the path of maybe just having the ID in the title, which is at least the current experiment as of recording I am running. Back to the showmaker. Now the showmaker has an incentive to maybe exaggerate a little bit just here and there in order to spark interest, in order to then get more views, at least on YouTube, in order to then have more ads that are selling basically per viewership, and also maybe probably the audience will not change that much. But if there is an audience that is maybe an audience that has a higher CPM, so a cost per million, which means that the advertisers would pay more for a given person to watch the ad before this show guest appears. So maybe it's not a cure for your health, but actually for your finances. So finance people and so on and so forth seem to be more valuable, or people interested in finance, so that it seems to be a higher CPM. At least that's what I heard. Now the showmaker, instead of stating in the title, okay, there is a certain likelihood that this cure has a 0.3% chance of increasing your lifespan by, I don't know, by 0.3 years. Then instead, this is now the anti-aging expert, or instead, this is now, this person has figured out death, or something like this along those lines. Which, no, there are two things that are happening. First of all, the showmakers obviously, to a certain extent, probably have the agreement of the person that is appearing on the show. But the person that is appearing on the show also, to a certain extent, has to accept this, whatever they are doing, because the person that is not the host is kind of being invited onto the format, and is therefore profiting off of all of the back processes that already have been happening. So if a show is already established and a guest comes on, then the guest kind of is the one, first of all, who is taking, at least from now the guest's perspective, the guest is basically tapping into this audience. There is an established audience, and the guest is now allowed to tap into this audience, and in return the guest then provides the value of being the novel thing, at least for this one episode. So there seems to be a kind of bilateral relationship by which the showmaker then probably accepts, okay, I have this guest on my show, and maybe I'll just let him get away with saying a couple of ridiculous things, and I don't say, okay, and even if I don't, and then it's more drama, because it's then more controversy in the interview itself. No, I don't think this. Oh, this is actually totally wrong what you're saying, and so thereby, of course, now these are contradictory incentives. Nonetheless, what I was trying to say is that if I now would be the guest and I would appear on this show, then I, to a certain extent, also would accept the frame that they then titled the episode, that they then cut the episode, that they might cut out certain parts. Of course, the showmakers might ask me if this is okay with me, and they might also give me a final cut. But what they also might do, and to a certain extent I am also agreeing to this, because I kind of already understand how this works and how YouTube works, and everybody is doing clickbait anyway, so I'm now the anti-aging expert. And now, if I would go onto the show, then we now have an anti-aging expert, even though I didn't say this is an anti-aging expert, and the showmakers also did not necessarily say it to a certain extent, but I mean, I also accepted it. So it's like, can we call you the anti-aging expert? And I'm like, sure. And so then I'm the anti-aging expert, and then the anti-aging expert is born out of this this bilateral agreement, and nobody really wanted this, but to a certain extent also everybody involved seems to have wanted this. Now, what is now the Turing problem? It's what follows, or what also doesn't follow, if you don't make the podcast tour. Let's say I'm again back to zero. I now can start my own channel, but I already have also this one interview, which did reasonably well. Now, what is the problem for me? That I cannot create this media type format. People now know me, but they know me because of this format. So the likelihood of me being invited again is not so great this time, because usually a show seems to, at least shows where people are interviewed, seems to kind of have an incentive to kind of interview different people, because otherwise it would get stale and boring. Because maybe I come back and I have now additional things to say, but maybe I also don't, because I only have written this one book about this one study. And so now what do? If I now create basically my own thing, then compared to this one episode, or maybe the 10 episodes, or maybe the 25 episodes I did on all of these different podcasts, where I was exposed to so many people, because this podcast has an audience of 2 million people, this podcast has an audience of 50,000 people, and so on and so forth. And if I now want to make my own format, where nobody interrupts me and asks reasonable questions, then I also have to take on the responsibility of now being the show maker. If I now am the show maker, and I now make a video titled, okay, there's a 0.03% chance of life expectancy increase by 0.3 years, then this media type, and also the formatting of this, and also how this is then appearing on the platform, this could be a YouTube video, is then compared to the others really boring, and also not thumbnailed properly. Even if I would now also learn the skills of making something like this, and maybe also cutting the video, what I would create is basically what I have to a certain extent just anticipated. Basically, I didn't really go onto the show and then call myself the anti-aging expert. But if I now make my own videos, and if I don't call myself the anti-aging expert in every single video, and with this routine I live to 640 years, then the problem might be that, well, I will not get that many views compared to the other things. So therefore, the podcasting tour creates a media format where I am, first of all, exposed to these different kinds of audiences, or these different kinds of audiences are exposed to me, but I cannot get access to these audiences because unless I make now a similar kind of media format. Now, if I just talk to the camera, the format is already different, because there also seems to be this social acceptance thing. Somebody else is sitting in the same room as I am, and somebody else is accepting the words I say. So now even if the other person does not necessarily say something contradictory, just by the presence of this other person, there is now a kind of a social acceptance to this. This one person, whom the audience already knows, accepts at least what the person, the show guest in this case, says. So there's already a kind of a establishing thing, a social establishing thing that is going on once a guest like this would appear on a show. Now, if I am on my own, and I'm on my own in front of a camera and just talking to a camera, and maybe not even to the camera because I'm looking onto my table the whole time, then this might now, compared to the other thing, be not that much of a good thing. So I want to conclude. First of all, the decision to, for example, if you are a famous movie star, to make your own show and to then have maybe 0 views on a video you made, but at the same time you're paid 17 million for a movie, that seems to be probably kind of harming your social credibility compared to you going on the show and then it gets 3 million views. Now, there's a risk involved in making kind of your own maybe brand also for yourself, because this is now not only being a guest on a show and somebody else is asking the questions, so you actually just accepted to be on the show and then you're answering the questions, which is basically the programming that is provided by the host or the show makers. Whereas if I now am on my own, and instead of somebody else saying, okay, we have this gym selfie of this guy and we found it online, somebody else sent this to me, sent this to us, and what do you say to this? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's my gym selfie, but I didn't want this to be posted. If instead I post a gym selfie, then the framing is different, because I am now both responsible for the show making as well as the content itself. So I now have both roles, which now seems more egoistic, which now might seem more narcissistic, because I don't have the other party. If I don't now want to create a format like this, and I've seen this with a couple of channels, which I sometimes watch, is that they now make kind of a podcasting setup, but then they talk to somebody who is not that important, because he seems to be not that important because he's not really in the video. The podcasting thing is just from the side and filmed like a usual podcast setup with a 2-camera setup like this and like this, and then you only see kind of the main character of the show, which is the person who owns the channel. And then the person who owns the channel acts as if the other person was actually kind of interested in what he or she is saying, which then makes it the more obvious that they are trying to recreate the format of touring podcasts. And so there seem to be many different aspects involved in this. The negative aspects are that it becomes that more obvious that you are then that you are the showmaker, that you are basically competing against something you cannot really compete against, which is an already established format, an already established show. And also, you're then lacking the social not accountability, but credibility, by not having a person in the room. And if you try to recreate it on your own channel, then, well, it might seem a little ridiculous.